Riverway board. I've had that position since the Riverway project started, and this is the 35th anniversary, so I've been around here a long time. And I was telling Jerry, I lived in Blue River for about 20 years, or around in and around Blue River, and then in 2010 moved to Muscadet. That's where the office is. But I'm also involved in some other organizations in leadership roles with Three Eagles Foundation, which is effigy mounds at Franks Hill, and the Cultural Landscape Legacies Group that works on protection of mound sites and rock art sites in the upper Midwest. And then recently with Ben and Bruce Moffett, with the Friends of the Cross Currents Heritage Center. So lots of involvement in local history and archaeology, as well as the history of the Riverway. So today I wanted to talk to you about the importance of transportation on the river. And we really start there, if you want to follow along with your handout, by looking at the river as a highway. It was the easiest mode of transportation, of course, going back to the Paleo-Indians at the end of the last ice age all the way forward. And what we see mostly in those early days of human habitation in this area would be the use of dugout canoes. And that's what you see in the upper right. And then the famous discoveries at the bottom of Lake Mendota recently, showing those that some can be as much as 2,500 or 3,000 or 4,000 years old. They're still dating the most recent discoveries. So those were canoes made out of tree stumps or logs that they were burned and shaved and burned and shaved and burned and shaved until they made their shape. And they would have used those in these areas we call the rice lakes, just east of Jones Lake, in the bottoms to gather wild rice, as well as transportation up and down the river. They did also have foot trails, which were based on game trails, and that's where a lot of our road system today comes from. For example, Highway 60 was an old Indian trail. So as we move forward through time, then we see the advent of the birch bark canoe. And that's on page 2 in the upper left, and that is an actual birch bark canoe. Now these canoes were very frail, so you couldn't pull them up on the rocks, and every time you had a load, you had to unload it. So the voyageurs and the trappers, they found this to be their very useful method of transportation. But they, as I said, were frail. So they packed everything in 80-pound packs, and each voyageur was expected to carry 2 packs at each portage. So he'd take an 80-pound pack, go half a mile or however long they had to, drop it, run back, get the other pack, piggyback it across the portage, go back and get the canoe. And then in addition, if there was an important person on board called les bourgeois, it was considered ungentlemanly to get your feet wet. So they had to lift this person out of the canoe onto shore and then back reversely on the other end of the portage. So they hated the portage. If there was any way they could shoot the rapids or do anything, they would try to do that. And the Voyager canoe trips that I guide on the river each summer, you could see in the top right photo, are replicas of those original birch bark canoes that would have been used on the large river systems in the upper Midwest. These were commissioned by the state of Wisconsin in 1998 in conjunction with the sesquicentennial. They're 25 feet long and 350 pounds. They're fiberglass, so they're very stable. But it's a wonderful way to see the river. If you've never taken those trips, put it on your radar for next year, because we do different segments. A lot of them are Muscadet to Port Andrew. When we look at the first written record of what the river looked like, because we know Ho-Chunk did not have, and the effigy mound builders did not have written language. It's all oral tradition. So the first written record comes from the journal of Father Marquette, when Marquette and Joliet made their historic voyage from Green Bay up the Fox River to Le Portage or Portage, and then down the Wisconsin River. And Joliet was a much better writer and cartographer, but his records were all lost, so we have to rely on the journal of Father Marquette. And Marquette said, the Wisconsin River is very broad with a sandy bottom that forms numerous shoals that render navigation difficult. It is full of vine-clad islands. On its banks, one sees diversified lands with woods, prairies, and hills. We saw oak, walnut, basswood, hickory, elm, maple, and another kind of tree armed with long thorns that has no name. And on the 17th of June, we entered the Father of Waters with a joy which I cannot express. And so what do we see today on the lower Wisconsin River? It's broad, sandy bottom, numerous shoals that render navigation difficult, vine-clad islands, the diversified lands, and many of the same species of trees. Now, the tree armed with long thorns that has no name is the honey locust. Because these folks were coming down from Canada and the northern part of the upper Midwest, and we are on the very north end of the range of honey locusts. So this was the first time as they're coming down the river they ever saw this tree armed with long thorns. You have to then recognize that because of that sandy bottom and the ever-changing currents, this was a river that you couldn't just ford. Like a lot of times in the old West movies, you'll see them splashing with their horses across the stream, and that's always a rocky bottom. Or if they have a muddy area, it's much more difficult. But in the sandy bottom, you can't really just walk across it or take horses or wagons or anything across this river. There were a couple places in low water conditions that they would try to cross, one of them being up by Orion on Highway 60, and another one further upstream by Mazomanie. There's a rocky riverbed there, and they were able, but very seldom could they do that. So the first person that actually came here to try to make a commercial use of the river was William Hamilton, who was the son of Alexander Hamilton. And he established a smelter at Muscadet, where he would take the lead ore from Highland and Centerville, that area, by ox cart down to Muscadet to the smelter. So this was in the 1830s. And he thought he was going to put it on barges and take it down to eventually Galena or other points south. Well, he quickly found out that the Wisconsin is not reliable for taking, we're just going to have a schedule and load up a barge and go. You can't do that. And even back before the dams, it was even a wilder river with fluctuating water levels. So then he had to finish the smelting process, load them back up on ox cart, and take the finished product back toward Highland, Dodgeville, eventually Galena. It would end up there. So they operated that smelter for a number of years, and then eventually he did sell the smelter to another person. But it would have been located, if you're familiar with the Victoria Riverside Park, and you take that walking path upstream along the river, it would be kind of where the Prairie Garden and that gazebo is at the end of the street there. So in order to get across the river, ferries were one of the major methods to cross the river. And one family in particular, the Laws family, L-A-W-S, operated a number of ferries up and down the river, all the way from Sauk City, Prairie du Sac, down to this area. And they would charge so much per person, so much per wagon, so much per horse, and then if you had livestock, so much for each pig or cow or whatever. And that was how they made their living. Sometimes they would have a rope or a cable stretched across the river, and sometimes they would pole across the river or paddle across the river. So you see in the lower left of page 2, it's kind of a typical ferry operation. But the Laws family that operated the ferry by Orion bought it after it had been open 1 year. And then they started with this big ferry boat on the lower right. And that crossed the river between Iowa County and Richland County, near where the Old Man River cabin is on Highway 60, right in that vicinity. And there was a good landing spot there. And so they built this house that then became the hotel, and in about 1850 was considered to be one of the largest structures in Richland County. And so they would ferry people across the river, and then they had housing for them. There was a spring right there, so they had a good business going there. So that is the kind of ferry boat that was used mainly for human transportation across the river. Well, then people thought, well, let's see if we can do the steamboats that are going up and down the Mississippi River and adapt them for Wisconsin River, trying to get all the way to Lake Michigan and then have a way to get to the Atlantic Ocean. The steamboats they used on the lower Wisconsin River were not like the big rear or stern paddle boats that you see on the Mississippi, or you think of those grandiose. These were much smaller in size, but nevertheless were able to navigate certain times of the year. And of course we have Port Andrew, because it was once a bustling river port for steamboats to be docked there, and had all of these different businesses that you would associate with an old frontier town, with a general store and livery stable, etc. Well, they've quickly found that while the lower Wisconsin could accommodate steamboats, it wasn't a reliable form of transportation, because you could only do it during those high water times. In the middle of summer, you absolutely couldn't. And if people tried to stretch that season out, then they get grounded on the numerous shoals that render navigation difficult, and then they're stuck there until the river comes up. So this led to people that were very enthusiastic about a canal. So we're in the canal building craze in America, Erie Canal, etc. So they wanted to build a canal from Portage to Prairie du Chien, using the river and the backwaters and going across the prairie, and they had plans for this. And so they were going to the legislature looking for funding to build this long canal, 100-mile long canal. At the same time, the railroad was really coming into its own. So we're now in the 1850 era. And Hercules Dousman, from Villa Louis fame, Louis Dousman was his son, went to the Capitol, and he also lobbied heavily, spread around the money, bought some legislators, and was an advocate for the railroad. The canal enthusiasts were continuing to try to build support for them. And in fact, one of my favorite quotes was from one of the canal enthusiasts who said, "The Wisconsin River remains a fickle jade upon which no reliance can be placed, and the pilot of one season would scarce recognize it the next." And that remains true today. We had a high water event earlier this summer that lasted for an extended period of time, and when I was back out on the river, I was amazed at how much it had changed just from May to late June, early July. So the steamboats did operate. They would go all the way up to Portage, and once in a while they would actually make it through the canal and down the Fox River to Green Bay. It was not a usual trip. Most of their trips later on ended at about Helena, near Spring Green. It's as far as they would make it. And eventually, of course, the railroad did win out, and that's the same railroad that we have right here, the same railroad tracks that John Muir walked down when he was going from UW-Madison to Prairie du Chien to see his girlfriend. He was a walker. The Ellen Hardy was one of those steamboats that was often on the lower Wisconsin River. And then, of course, we have Steamboat Island just up from the Port Andrew boat landing, which was so named because of a wreck. The last, based on some research I did for this talk, the last sighting that's recorded of a steamboat going up and down the river like a regular steamboat would be 1892. So they still were in operations, and all of the railroad bridges and the toll bridges with other kind of bridge crossing there was, had to have the swing span or the lift span to accommodate steamboats, because the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 says freedom of navigation on all tributaries of the Mississippi River. And so that's why you still used to see those swing spans. For instance, the Muscadet Bridge that precedes this one, supposedly the only time that lift span was open was on the ribbon cutting day. Then you see some pictures from Boscobel. They didn't reproduce very good for this, but they're showing the steamboats that were operating there by Boscobel. And then there actually were a couple excursion boats that operated out of Muscadet, and that's what you see in the lower left. And again, it was not a very lucrative endeavor commercially because of that fickle nature of the Wisconsin River. But then there was a fellow who was called the Riverman, and I have to read this passage this is from John Duffy's compilation. I have these available at my office in Muscadet if anyone's interested. It's a Lions Club fundraiser. But it talks about this fellow, his last name was Gies, Henry Gies. It says, Mr. Henry Gies and Miss Gertrude Pod were married May 7th, 1905 at the home of the bride's sister in Minnesota. Both parties to this life contract are well and favorably known in Muscadet. Henry is a native of this village. He's a carpenter and a man of sterling character. The bride formerly lived here, where she attended school and has since been teaching in Minnesota and Dakota. Other young ladies, and some, by the way, old enough to be near the danger line, looked with goo-goo eyes toward the Commodore. But Cupid would have none of it and shot his arrow to the far north. So Henry, on a beautiful May morning, boarded his fine gasoline yacht and went down the old Wisconsin to its mouth and then up the Mississippi to Winona, Minnesota, where he found his bride at a little station about 30 miles west of that city. His trip on the water covered about 300 miles, and he did it in a little less than 50 hours. I love that language in that newspaper story. He was a good writer. So that's one of the few commercial successes that we did see on the river, with a few of these excursion boats and small, like we have the canoe livery operators now, the outfitters. Those are about the only good commercial exercises once the ferries had kind of left the scene. But ferries were still in operation as much as late as the early 1900s, because when the Blue River Bridge collapsed in a windstorm, they used ferries to get across the river. But the steamboats have one other thing that's relevant to Tippesaki across the river, and this is from John Duffy's book also, but he talks about Vester Hansen. So some of you, I'm sure, will remember that character. Yes, exactly. So this says, when anyone asked Vester about his location, he'd say Port Andrew. This was the location of the earliest crossings of the Wisconsin River, and a man by the name of Captain Andrew owned a steamboat that plied our river in the Mississippi. Vester always told one of Captain Andrew's famous trips when he took a load of cattle from this area to Kansas City and returned with a load of household goods, one item which was a piano. Vester said the old piano was still in the old Coombe farmhouse at John Kirkpatrick Farm. That piano has to be a real antique, according to John. Certainly, if you have an opportunity to tour the farmhouse, you could see the old piano is still there, thanks to the Moffats and their predecessors. So as I mentioned, then the railroad won out, and that changed the game for everyone. So these small river ports such as Port Andrew, Richland City, they began to fade, and it was a rather steep decline because everybody moved to be by the railroad. And Blue River, originally called Minnehaha, then Blue River Station, and then just Blue River, was one of the main livestock shipping centers along the river. And we had the stockyards down here to the north side of town. And so on the back of the handout, you'll see the old depot and the steam engine pulling in, and then the stockyards. So people would use that all the time to get their, the train to get their animals to market. And Blue River became the big shipping post for that. And if you notice, because steam engines require wood, and sometimes coal, but fuel and water, all of these towns along the lower Wisconsin, let's just start at Mazomanie, are about 6 to 8 miles apart. Because that's how far you could go before you had to take on water or fuel. So you go Mazomanie to Arena, to Spring Green, to Lone Rock, to Avoca, to Muscadet, to Blue River, to Boscobel, to Whitman, and they're all the way down to Bridgeport and eventually to Prairie du Chien, and they're all about that same distance apart. And so everyone gravitated toward the railroad for commerce, and that's when Muscadet moved from lower town along the river to upper town by the railroad, and that's where the center of commerce is in that town. And of course for Blue River, it was right here, and that's where you had the hotels and all the other businesses that were related to the rail transportation and getting goods to and from market. So the railroad had a profound influence on the settlement era and helped expedite settlement in this area. And I still hear people telling stories about riding the train to Madison, hopping on and going to Madison and back in a day and getting shopping done. And it seems like a much different time. I took my grandson to North Freedom to ride on the train this week, and I was thinking about the passengers, because boy, for tall guys like Bruce and Ben and I, sitting in those seats, you got no leg room. I would have to probably get by an extra seat or something, I guess. And so that we see that the railroad had continued in existence for all this time. It was a period of time there where there wasn't a lot of traffic on the rail. But now there is that renaissance in using rail as a method of transportation, to, not necessarily for passengers, although they do have an occasional excursion train, but really for getting grain and other goods from this area down. So that was my quick trip for you, focusing on transportation in the Riverway. As just to finally put a bow on this, so the Riverway is 92 miles long and approximately 100,000 acres, and includes public and private lands both. So DNR has to get permits from the Riverway Board just like a private individual does, and our mission is to protect the scenic beauty and natural character of this 92-mile, 100,000-acre project. So it's been my privilege to work almost my entire career with the Riverway Board, going back 35 years, and to see this project from its infancy back in the very tumultuous early days when there were lots of nasty letters to the editor and lots of violence at meetings, and now where it's kind of like Pax Americana here. We're fairly happy with how things are going, and we continue to work with our friends at the legislature and at the governor's office to keep this project funded. We're the smallest state agency in Wisconsin, so you have 50% of the staff represented here today. So thank you. I'd be happy to take some